Yes, sir.
You know, historically speaking, there's been a lot of environmental racism. And maybe sometimes, as a person of color, you look at the environmental movement as sometimes being quote-unquote a white movement. Mm-hmm. And when you go through this revitalization processes throughout major cities in the United States, there's a gentrification process that comes along with it. That sometimes poor, low-income communities, communities of color, are moved out of certain areas that are scheduled to be redeveloped.
Can everybody hear? Okay, because I just want people to hear your words.
And, you know, what concerns me, as you mentioned that model where the streets were undulating and curving, and you said the property values naturally went up. Sometimes, you know, when that process happens, poor low-income communities of color are basically moved out of their own communities because they can no longer afford to live into them. Also, what I see happens, you know, where these natural resources like rivers and streams and creeks and bays and beaches, is that these affluent communities start gaining off access to these very public spaces that were public monies were used to develop them, and pretty soon low-income communities are detached from these very natural places, and I'm always concerned that this happens in these communities, the gentrification process, and how can we, in your experience, in your travels, I know you were in Korea, China, and you're dealing, and maybe even Brazil, you might be more of a multicultural mix, but you know, like in Seoul, it's mostly one culture, and China's one culture. How do you get that us working together and that everyone really benefits and that the poor aren't pushed out when these areas are developed and only upper middle class are using these very nice spaces and places that have been used, that have been developed with taxpayer money and taxpayer efforts?
This is a great point. I'm totally glad you brought it up, and I'm glad that you're here bringing that voice. All I can say is that there's I'll reference you to a collaboration that myself and the Oxnard Arts and Ecology Center is in the middle of right now. Go on the web and look up Movement Generation. And it's a collaboration. There's now 60 people of color, low income, social justice, environmental justice, urban organizations in East Bay, Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco area. And we've been doing these for several years now, these trainings that we call Movement Generation on exactly this question. We start with a 3-day residential training with these leaders of these citizen groups. Here was where it came from. A bunch of them, you know where Bayview, Hunters Point is in San Francisco? It's an area that is a typical environmental racism-based situation where's the power plant going to go that's belching all the particulate stuff? Oh, it's going to go to Bayview, Hunters Point, right? And so the community folks are fighting there for affordable housing, for a bunch of stuff. And all of a sudden they forecast their win of we're going to win in 20 years and we'll build our appropriate housing. And then someone said, oh, by the way, that's underwater when climate change hits in 20 years. And they had this epiphany like, oh, I guess maybe the realistic perception that much of big environmental groups was a primarily a white-based movement, that people of color are, all of the disadvantaged communities need to step up and figure out like, wow, this is actually, ironically or not ironically, much of the pain and suffering of what we'll see with climate change will actually fall on the backs of disadvantaged communities disproportionately. So we've been doing these ecological literacy training around water, climate, energy, gentrification, class, structure as ways to support participation, engagement, and relationship of those communities in these processes to try and not allow what you very appropriately described we've seen occur in many areas. So all I can say is a bunch of us are deeply involved in that work and are honoring it and working with it and trying to support it and check out this work of movement generation. I think it's some of the most creative stuff going in California with this constituency on this question right now. It's a great question.